All right. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Just a quick heads up, depending on when you are listening to this. A few of you have asked me if I offer an introductory strength training program or when Kettlebells Made Simple is coming back, which, by the way, they're the same thing. So just a friendly heads up that Isabel and I are opening enrollment for Kettlebells Made Simple right now. The actual program will start on January 23rd of 2022. But if you sign up before Christmas Day, you will save $50 on enrollment. So what is it? It is an 8-week strength training program that teaches you how to use kettlebells and get strong at home. There are options if you have a history of pain or injury, or if you're hypermobile. However, this is not physical therapy. We are not rehab professionals. We are not medical professionals. So if you have a lot of stuff currently going on, you should probably check with your doctor, or you might want to hold off on signing up. However, if you have sort of moved past that phase and you're ready to get back into strength building, then this program is for you. So to learn more about it, you can go to kettlebellsmadesimple.com, or I've included the links both in the YouTube description as well as in the podcast show notes. So enough rambling from me. Thanks so much for being here and for listening, and let's get into the episode. This is Nikki Nablevy, and you are listening to Results Not Typical, a podcast that challenges the traditional narrative of Pilates and fitness while tackling misinformation that is keeping you from reaching your fitness goals. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Results Not Typical. I am excited to have Caitlin Doherty with me today. She's a yoga teacher and mentor, and we're going to talk about this idea of trying to slow down, as well as sort of how our culture, particularly capitalistic patriarchal culture and diet culture, makes it so hard for us to do this. So welcome, Caitlin. Thanks for having this chat with me today.
Thank you. Yeah, just a light convo, Yeah.
Not rooted in challenging ideas at all.
Oh, totally. We're just going to breeze through it.
All right. So before we sort of dive into the thick of it, which I think we'll end up going there pretty quick, just for anyone who's not familiar with you and your work and what you do you mind maybe just telling everyone who's listening a little bit about yourself?
Yes. Hi, I'm Caitlin Doherty. As Nikki mentioned, I use she, her pronouns, and I create space for folks to, as we're going to talk about, slow down, gently move their bodies, and really cultivate radical care practices. And we'll probably get into why care practices have to be radical sometimes in this world that we live in. But really my goal is just to help people who have, formerly or still are caught up in these systems to carve out some space for themselves and learn to thrive within them, because the reality is that we do live it within these systems and we do benefit from them. And how can we be ourselves within them and not be so small and silent and, not taking up space? So that's a lot. And I'm sure we'll get into all of that. But yeah, if you want the shortened version, yoga teacher, self-acceptance mentor, just helping you be more you.
Great. So I'm always like, where do we start with the topics that are really big and complex, that can only be deconstructed so much and very much varies on individual experience? But let's start here. We kind of alluded to these systems. I gave them names: patriarchal society and diet culture. Do you think it might be worth explaining why this idea of slowing down and self-care is so radical when these are the systems that most of us culturally, at least here, let's just say in the US, have kind of grown up in, particularly as women, I think?
Hmm. Yes. Yeah, I think you named it. It is a tight, like a kind of conditioning. We've all been groomed to, I hate to use that word, but groomed to kind of like behave in these ways and be small and take up less space, both like physically and like emotionally. Oh my gosh, I've heard you're too sensitive for my whole life. Um, so it's not just about like our physical bodies and the appearances that we present to the world, but also like, the moods and emotions that we put out into the world. And these systems really thrive because we stay in line. And so, you know, we have maybe for a very long time helped these systems continue to thrive without even knowing it. And that's not to like shame or blame anybody. It's very normal for all of us to have kind of fallen under this guise of I'm being healthier, I'm taking care of myself, when in fact, we might have been doing the opposite, not only for ourselves, but for, greater humanity too.
Yeah. I mean, I think what comes to mind for me in this moment is we talk about this is like when I work with private clients, but this is also very much my own story, is how much of the conversation ends up coming down to I'm like, so you want to take better care of yourself? I would actually suggest doing less more intentionally. And what always comes up in that moment, and this is no judgment, I struggle with this myself, is they're like, "Whoa, that's hard." Right? This idea of doing less is like, right? Like being like, I'm going to be more intentional what I do, and I'm going to do significantly less of it, right? I'm going to work out less, but more intentionally, right? I am going to give myself more rest. Like this idea of being intentional and doing it brings up so much anxiety for so many of us. And I do think that comes back to our culture and how so much of it is ingrained in this idea of like, you must be hustling all the time. But that's a really fast way to get depleted. And like you said, I don't think it benefits us, but I also don't think it benefits anyone around us because we're just exhausted all the time. And it's really hard to make good decisions for yourself or anyone or do good work in anything you're doing when you're just tired,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We're tired. And yet we're afraid to slow down and rest. And it is so scary. And I want to name that and normalize that because it's so important. And I still go through this myself. I was sick a couple weeks back. And after a couple of days, I was like, okay, body, let's like get it going. I'm ready to not be sick anymore. And it's like, okay, still working on being okay with resting. And when we talk about general rest, we're not just talking about like taking naps, which are fabulous also, but it's also, like you said, slowing down our movement. And maybe our movement is in smaller chunks. Sometimes I'm like, all I can handle today is a 10-minute, routine. And it's not intense. I'm not sweating. I'm not going to be sore tomorrow. But that's what I need. And that's the capacity I have. But that is really hard. It is really hard because it's counterculture. It's completely against this like hustle and grind. And not only do we have to be productive when we're sitting at our desks, right? But we have to be productive in the way we eat, the way we move, our relationships. I mean, like, let's optimize every part of ourselves to make sure we're like the best, brightest, bubbliest, skinniest, whitest version. And so it is hard. And I appreciate you naming that because it's still hard for me, someone who helps people with this.
I mean, I do think there's something to be said for if you struggle with it, I think sometimes it's easier to help other people who struggle with it. I think that's worth putting out there. But something else you brought up there that I think is really interesting, right, is this idea of like, well, the best is the most optimized. And to me, what I'm finding more and more, and I'm curious to get your take, is actually like, my husband is much better at just being a self-aware, calm human than I am, right? I'll get frustrated that I can't do all the things as optimized as possible. And he's like, so you're a human. And like, that's just all and I'm just like, he's like, you're not a robot, you're a human. But there's something very inhuman, about this idea that we're supposed to be optimized. We're not. There's no space for joy, and there's no space for being human within optimization when we look at it from that place. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. We're robotic in our movement, and we're checking off boxes. And if we're doing what we think we should be doing or what we're supposed to be doing, yeah, we have no room for joy, pleasure, like love, hope, all of these really wonderful ways of being that allow us to, I don't know, enjoy our lives,
Yes. So when we sort of look at the work that you do, and I know that you've sort of had your own, let's just call it, I hate the word journey, but I'm going to use it right now, right? Like, I know you've had your own kind of, I've watched The Bachelor, I blame it on that. But
Totally.
I know you've had like kind of, this whole like journey with yoga, so to speak. And the way that you teach and approach and practice yoga now is not the same as perhaps when you started. So do you want to maybe speak to how yoga for you and sort of the way that you work has been kind of a vehicle for sort of finding this place of like self-acceptance and slowing down? Because I do think one of the things about yoga that's kind of, and this is fitness, this is everything, right? So this isn't just to criticize yoga. It's just, again, our culture is, it oftentimes ends up turning into this very performative thing of I'm going to do the back bend and drink the green juice and like all of this stuff. And that's all fine and good if you're the type of person you're listening and you love that. But I find that that's a very different experience than kind of approaching yoga from the place that you're teaching it and the way that you're kind of holding space for it.
Yes. And thank you for saying green juice, because I was just thinking about this today and maybe, in preparation for this conversation, but I was thinking about how most of us, or a lot of us, and myself included, our journey with yoga might have started from a place of, mine started in a hot yoga studio. So that might just give you an idea. And hot yoga, again, is fine if that's what you are into. But it made me feel worse about myself. And it made me feel worse in general. Just the high temperatures and the like fast moving, the fast pacedness of it all. And so it made me feel worse. And at the time, I don't think I would have known. I don't think I could identify that, because I thought, oh, this is how it's supposed to feel. Because we're, again, so conditioned to believe that like movement, exercise, any self-improvement should feel like shit, right? Which is so counterintuitive. If we're working to improve, our lives, ourselves, like we should feel good. We should be able to harness compassion for ourselves. But I definitely think in Western society, there's an idea of yoga that is, thin, flexible, fit, hot, vinyasa, kind of all of these like words may come up when you think of yoga. And in my work, I'm really trying to change the narrative around that. Bring it back to the roots of yoga, which is, ancient. It's an ancient Indian tradition and practice. And there's so much outside of the movement is important. And there's so much outside of the movement within the yoga practice that is so beneficial, can be so beneficial for so many people's day to day. And we lose that when we focus on those trendy words, or we focus just on aesthetics or fitness, or doing a vinyasa flow as fast as we can. So yes, I started there too. And I found my way to gentle yoga. And I was like, what is this practice? Like, this isn't yoga. I don't know what this is. And now that to me is yoga at its core, is this like really gentle, slow, intentional, linked with breaths, almost philosophical experience. And of course, it doesn't have to be that for you. But if you feel bad when you do yoga, you don't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is there is this moment, I think, when we know that we are kind of in this heightened state of doing too much. I'll just call it that. For me, it's more of like a Tasmanian devil spiraling out when it's been really bad, but it's that, right, where we're like, I have to slow down. And then it's so interesting, right? That internal resistance that happens when we realize that. And then we get exposed to, like, I'll just call it the other side, that there's another choice. And we're like, oh, but that doesn't count. Right. Like, I think that sometimes that's like the first thought that pops into our head is like, if we haven't gotten there yet, we're like, I know I need to slow down. And then we're like, what can I do? That's like, again, another weird, aggressive version of this, because like my background, I was originally introduced to yoga also through like a SWAT, a very hot, sweaty, like I call it the flop and flow vinyasa class, where they would cram 40 people into the tiny, this was before COVID, y'all, and I was in my 20s, but they would like cram, 40 people into the tiniest room in the world with like nothing but like hot vents. And you would just be dripping the moment you walked in. And I was like, yep, I'm in chronic pain from doing all of this high intensity group fitness. So I'm going to slow down with the most aggressive form of hot yoga I can find. Now, was I consciously saying that? Obviously not. But I do think it's interesting that it's like our brains, because we're so conditioned to perform, some of us, we just sort of jump from like, okay, well, that's not working. Well, let me find my zen with something really aggressive. And it is so hard to slow down. So when people are kind of in that place of like trying to get comfortable with the slowing down, which is very uncomfortable and scary, what are some of the tools that people can use, or sort of some of the awareness that you find has helped people? Because my guess is that like people are probably on board with the ideas by the time they come to you, but there's probably still a little part of them that's kind of still like stuck in this. They're not doing it on purpose, but like the hustle culture or the need to do more.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I taught a class this morning, and you could just kind of tell by people's expressions and body language and stuff that like, I slowed our class way down today, even more so than I usually do, which is like fairly slow. And you could tell people were uncomfortable with that. And so I just called attention to that fact. And I didn't say, hey, you're uncomfortable with moving slow, but I asked everybody to like be with that feeling. If you're feeling like, damn, this is slow, and this is crazy how slow it is, it's okay. Just be with that, allow it to exist. And so I think there is this practice of like mindfulness within practice of slowing down that has really helped me, where first off, like, we're just like anything, we're not going to be good at rest unless we do it and try it and practice it. And like being okay with those uncomfortable thoughts of this is so slow and I'm a terrible person and I'm not moving fast enough. And then bringing some like kindness and self-compassion to ourselves in those moments, and trying not to judge ourselves or that dialogue that comes up. And really the only way to, again, get good at rest. And I don't really think like, I don't like to throw words like good and bad in there, but to get more comfortable with rest it is something that you just keep coming back to. You keep trying and experiment with different ways of doing it. I still find myself sometimes so hyped up, depending on whatever's going on, that in any given day, it's hard for me to access that ability to slow down. I'm like buzzy and I'm getting stuff done, and so I'm just like, I sit with that. And even if I do a breath work practice so that I can kind of like calm my nervous system, I'm like, okay, my mind is really busy today. That's okay. So there's a lot of mindfulness, there's a lot of practicing, and that's also the practice of yoga is, that mindfulness, awareness, actually just showing up for the practice. So that's what I would recommend. And I know it's not like a 5-step, perfect plan that you can check off, but just knowing that it's a process. I hate when people say that too. It's a journey, it's a process. But it is. And it's a practice. I like that better. It's a practice.
Yeah. And I mean, I think such a huge piece of this is, and something you've kind of pointed out here, that I just kind of reiterate it because I think it's important, is that like, even if we're talking about yoga, it's not necessarily about the poses. It's about bringing the awareness back to kind of like, okay, what is my internal state? What's going on? What am I sensing? And that is really hard. And I will say, this might seem like a misnomer, but I think this plays into what you're talking about. It was like 2 weeks ago, I was at a somatics training, and it was all the polyvagal theory stuff. And the person who is leading it, Kevin, it's great. But like something Kevin always asks you, like when he's like, it's always just like, and how does this make you feel? And I, Nikki, the queen of dissociation, spent a lot of time opting out and disassociating. And by the end of the 4 days, I was like, Kevin, if you ask me how I feel one more time, I was like, I mean, it was by the fourth day, I was like, the only reason I'm still here is because we're friends. Otherwise, I would have pieced out because I'm so tired of my self-awareness. I'm like, this is exhausting. No wonder I disassociate. But what was so funny was the day after the training ended, right? Because I'm always like, we have things to do. Let's not notice how we feel. I caught myself. I was going to answer email, and I was like, like a little like troll. I was not that that's bad, but I was like crouched over my computer, like trying to answer email as fast as I could. And I was like, why am I rushing to write an email? This I mean, like my internal state was just like, let's do everything as fast as possible. And it was like, pause, breathe, assess awareness. This feels like dread. Answering my inbox feels like dread. That's interesting. Let's just take a beat, and then let's just do nothing. Let's just notice it and do nothing. And it was such a novel moment for me as someone who's constantly trying to check out. And I do think that is the power of being in a class setting or an environment like what you're cultivating. That's kind of where I was going with this. Now I know, is this idea of like, it is really uncomfortable, but having that guided in that moment does, I think, in many ways carry over into our life if we're sort of willing to let ourselves be in that space that like we're a little bit allergic to, if it's not something that we necessarily naturally do or something that we naturally shy away from, because noticing what you're feeling can be really unpleasant, because sometimes those feelings aren't good. Or even if they're positive feelings, depending on your trauma history, positive feelings can actually be really scary and feel very unsafe,
Right. Yeah. And like spark a lot of anxiety. Cause it's like, oh, I am feeling good. Oh shit, what's going to happen next? I'm going to die on the way home. Like that's very dark, but that's like a little bit of internal monologue. Like, yeah, it can be really scary. And it feels like if I sit down, I'm basically inducing anxiety because yeah, that part, we're just not used to that. Sitting down to be with those thoughts is like, oh, kind of skeevy and weird feeling. And thank you for sharing that, because that's so relatable, that I think a lot of times people think they have to show up to movement or yoga or mindfulness perfectly. Like, I have to be able to do it how I've seen it, or like, and I think we just live in a culture where we're not allowed to show up to practice. We have to show up with the, bow perfectly tied, and like, we have to have it all figured out, and we have to be successful, whatever that means. The second we launch a business, I mean, these are just a few of the ways that it shows up in my life, but you can show up to yoga and not know what the hell you're doing. And that can be enough. And like, the practice is in practicing, not being perfect. And so it's kind of that like meta, like, in my life, I'm trying to show up more myself, and it's really hard to actually do that. And yoga, I think, well, I guess this type of yoga that we're talking about gives you the opportunity to actually practice that.
Yeah. And where that kind of goes in my head is this idea of acceptance, because there is then that moment of accepting that, like, it's all kind of a mess sometimes, not always, but like, for most of us, there's life is kind of messy. And you had posted on Instagram a couple of weeks ago, right? This idea of, you're like, I don't really love the word imperfect because it suggests that there's a perfect and there is no such thing as perfect. And that was one of those like very meta moments too, where I was like, well, that's kind of profound, is this idea that it's like, let it be imperfect. And it's kind of like, I was like, we don't even have a choice. It's always going to be imperfect. And I think it's so interesting that we've had an indoctrinated into ourselves to strive for something that doesn't exist and cannot be attained.
That's really powerful. How have we been operating that way for so long, when we're never going to reach that? Yeah, I'm like sitting with that. That is really powerful. And that's kind of the first step, is like recognizing that. And, well, shit, I've been living under this false idea for my whole life. And now I get to like unpack and uncover that as slowly as I need to, of course, with as much care and compassion as I need to. But perfect does not exist. And this ideal that we've believed that we can all attain, right? This like thin white cishet perfect ideal is like, when you actually think about it, those are what some people can relate to, but it's not everyone. The reality is that we're all outside of that, perfect ideal in some way. I think more of us are outside of it than we realize. And so by stepping away from that, we also allow others to be who they are, and we're not only accepting of our, not being perfect, but of everyone else's differences as well. And that's a really important part of the practice as well.
Yeah, I think you bring up such a good point there with this idea of, it's like, I do think a lot of creating space for more expression in all of the ways, right? That's a very broad statement. But I do think so much of that is when we see other people who are sort of willing to be like, I think I'm done with this particular hamster wheel and I'm going to just step off of it. I think when we see other people modeling stepping off of it, it gives us in our heads an idea that maybe we have that option too, because so much of why we're on the hamster wheel in the first place is like, thank goodness my parents don't listen to this podcast, but no, but I just feel like every single one of these, I'm just like more and more unpacking things I'm not supposed to say about my childhood. But I do think that it's things that are modeled to us in childhood. And I love my parents very much. They are good people, but something that was modeled to me was like, no, you must always be the best. You must always do more. You must always achieve. And it's always been really to the point of maybe some people can have really healthy boundaries around that, but I don't have healthy boundaries around that. It's always been to the point of sacrifice of self. Right? Achieving something is more important than actually taking care of yourself. And I share that because I think that message is so prevalent, at least with the people who I interact with in my life. And I think that when we see other people go, like where I'm at these days, and this is me now, I'm like, I don't want to try that hard anymore. That really didn't do anything good for me. It didn't do anything good for my family. It didn't do anything good for my life. It didn't do anything good for my business. I think I'm done trying so hard. There's something kind of powerful in just being like, I'm going to step away from this now.
Yeah, exactly. And it does bring up a lot from our childhoods. I have done a lot of, excuse me, I've done a lot of work on that front as well. And I work with kids. My day job is nanny, and that shit will make you face all of the stuff that you learned as a child, because it is so true that that's where we hear it first. It's with our family unit, and that's who we, get our information from, we believe. When we're that little, our parents or our caregivers are our heroes. And this is like a kind of a separate example, but I take the kids to a music class every week, and it was raining on Thursday, which you do stuff in the rain. It's not weird. But in the South and Southeast is where we're at more accurately. It's like, if it rains, you don't go out, And I love going out in the rain. And so we had music class in the rain, and we had a tent over us, but only a couple people showed up. And we were just talking about this idea that these messages start so early. These kids are under 2 years old, and their caregivers are like, we're not going to go to music class. It's raining. And it's kind of a totally off topic example, but I think it shows that we have these ideas of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. You don't play in the rain. You'll catch a cold, which is actually a myth. And that stuff comes up in my family all the time because I have nieces and nephews. And so I'm replaying my childhood all the time. And when when people are saying things to my nieces and nephews, it's like, oh no, oh no, oh no. And it's that's another part of the process though, is that inner child healing. So without getting too much into our childhoods, but I think it's important to address, because we can't not address the fact that we learn a lot of how we act and behave in the world during those first few years.
Yes. And I think what's kind of interesting about that conversation is these beliefs are kind of they're programmed into us, not to get too woo, but they're pretty subconscious, but then they'll manifest as we get older. And then I think only in the last year, I think the pandemic really forced me to face some shit, to be honest. But you end up saying things out loud or right, or demonstrating that you believe something in a way, even if you would say cognitively that you don't believe it. And you're like, where did that come from? And I'm always like, that came from my childhood. And then I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. And I think that's what's so interesting is it does but because it was taught to us so young, we're just kind of okay, there's it just gets in there deep, and it gets in there early. And I think that's what's so hard. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think sometimes I think I've seen you and some other people use the word deprogramming. And I'm wondering if that's kind of when you speak about deprogramming, if that's kind of some of the stuff that you're alluding to, because that's a language that gets used a lot. But if you are not necessarily in that subsection of study or Instagram, you won't necessarily be exposed to those words, but I don't think sometimes people realize what we mean when we talk about that stuff.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. It really is, maybe excavating is another word. Uncovering, it's an unlearning. That's another one that might be helpful, because we have learned how to behave in the early part of our lives. And then we are now undoing that learning. And that is so hardwired into our being that it is this whole system. I mean, if you think about it in terms of like computers, it's like, I don't know much about computers, but it's like taking Windows off and putting, the Apple operating system on. It's completely different. And of course, there will be parts of you that come along for the full ride. There are parts of us that are kind of always with us, but it is a huge undoing, unlearning to then relearn, okay, well, how do I now want to show up in the world? Because now I have options. And as you said, it didn't make sense. Like until I thought about it and said, why do we say that shit? Okay, now I have the freedom and the opportunity to recreate like the life that I want to live, the language I use, what I pass down to like my children or my nieces and nephews. And I think a lot of times, like our parents and their parents were just doing what they learned and just continuing the cycle. And not to get too far off, that's how we're still in a place of awareness and undoing of white supremacy, because there's a point where that cycle has to break and we have to question and we have to start to do things differently. And I think it applies here when we talk about, body acceptance and slowing down. It is a whole reworking of that system, that internal computer system, even though we're not computers, but
Yeah, it's I think that's absolutely relevant to this conversation. And I think that it is messy and complicated and nuanced. And unlike computers, very much a process. And there's not a playbook for it. I think that's the thing in all of this conversation that we're having, is that there is no playbook. And you brought up another thing in there that I wanted to make sure that we got to in our conversation, which is you work a lot with people around this idea of body acceptance. And I think sometimes when people hear body acceptance, they think of it as this idea of like, well, I'm just going to love everything about myself and my body all the time. And I think that's not the most realistic, but also I don't think that when people who are actually teaching body acceptance, like you are talking about body acceptance, I don't think that's what you mean. That's not the sense I get. Because there's, again, has to be space for all of these messy feelings. So sort of to you, you can share a little bit about your own story or just kind of your own experience, right? Or the approach you take with people. But how do you define body acceptance? Like was people are sort of trying to navigate that for themselves, and maybe they're like, okay, I'm done sort of chasing this like asinine ideal of what, it's often women, but it's all of us, right? Of like what I'm supposed to look like, even though it's wildly unrealistic, probably not a good idea, definitely not serving of one's health physically or mentally. But that body acceptance piece can feel a little like Pandora's box. It's really big and scary. And you're like, I don't know if I want to open that. I don't know what's in there. So do you want to speak to what that process looks like? At least I know it's different for everyone, but from your perspective.
Yeah. I'll say the first thing I think that we can get hung up on is, or that may be the first step in our process, is that we're focused on the external physical body that's presented to the world. So when we think of like body acceptance, we're like, oh, we have to like feel good about our bodies all the time, as you alluded to. We have to like how we look all the time. And I think body acceptance is so much more nuanced and has a wider range than that. I think it's this idea of tuning into our inherent worth that is there the day that we're born and like literally never leaves us. I think it's knowing that we are more than our physical bodies that are presented to the world. I mean, think of all the cool shit that you bring to the world, your values, your skills, your traits that have nothing to do with this thing that people see. And so it encapsulates so much more than just the physical appearance of the body. And I think it really starts to move into just overall self acceptance. And, you know, if we have been diagnosed with something or, you know, deal with chronic pain, like that's a part of it too. And so it's also, how do I learn to work with this body that I have right now as it stands or sits or lays or whatever? How do I give it what it needs in this phase of life? And that's the great thing about body acceptance, is that it ebbs and it flows. You know, it's not, I just had a baby and I have to get back to my pre-baby weight. It's like, I just had a baby. What do I need? Or I just had a death in the family. What do I need? It is everything. It is meeting ourselves with kindness and compassion throughout every single phase of life, and honoring all the parts of ourselves too.
Yeah. And I think that's really powerful. And I think that that's really important because so often the messaging in yoga and in fitness, right, is this like, always strive to be better, right? Always be motivated, push 110%. And I'm always like, fuck you. Clearly you've never had a mental health crisis because right. No, I mean, like, I'm not trying to be funny, but like, it's one of those things where it leaves absolutely no space, that type of messaging, for the human experience and for the complexity of what it is to be human. And when so many of us are already coming from a place of feeling run down, feeling overworked, feeling stressed out, having too much going on. And I say that as like someone with immense privilege who still feels that way, right? So like, I don't even have those barriers to entry as someone who has more marginalized identities than I do, right? If that is like the default for like the average privileged person, there's absolutely no space to like meet yourself where you're at and approach something in a way that's actually sustainable and is actually going to make you feel better. And so I do think that piece of acceptance is so important because, yes, I think that as human beings, we're all very capable and unique in different ways. But I think we all have a unique set of challenges and considerations. And to pretend that those things aren't happening is it's just not very helpful. It's not very constructive. And it doesn't do good things for us in the long term because we can't escape ourselves. Those things are a part of us and they're normal. Like, I think that's the other thing is like all of that stuff, that health stuff, those challenges, those feelings, all of it is normal.
Absolutely. And to your point earlier about how perfect, shouldn't even exist because, I mean, imperfect shouldn't even exist because then it relies on the fact that perfect is a thing. No, we're all normal. We're all experiencing a range of emotions and difficult situations and the trauma that we may have experienced in earlier years. And we don't improve by meeting ourselves with shame or by meeting other people with shame. There's not much good that comes from that. And that's a radical shift from, the way we might have been brought up or our parents were raised. But meeting people, each other, ourselves, with the absence of shame, like that feels like kind of a light bulb. And because I think we're scared that if we meet ourselves with compassion, then we'll be lazy or, and I think that's a whole other discussion about that word. But there's this fear of not, again, coming back to, there's this fear of not doing enough, of being lazy, of not optimizing all of the time.
Yeah. And again, I think it's so programmed into us. And it's funny because this is like, oh, how many of Nikki's triggers can we list in one podcast in under 50 minutes? But it's like, yeah, I know I share this because I know that like, this is actually a pretty standard default. Most people probably, not everyone wants to admit it as freely as I do, but it's like, yes, I would rather be productive than sit with my anxiety and my fears. I know this about myself. Mm-hmm. I also know that when I meet someone who's too go with the flow, who at the same time doesn't own their challenge, like, again, I perceive that they don't. I've just learned this now. If I meet someone, it's usually in a massage training. I haven't been to one of those in a while, right? And they just seem like a little bit too like, I quit my job. I moved to Hawaii. I've just been hanging out on my funds on an island for a year. I'm immediately like, get away from me. And like, I don't like that person. I'm so sorry for that person. I'm thinking of one person right now in a training, by the way, who is, and I remember the first time I met them and I immediately was like I just like vacillating to the other side of the room, right? Like internally. And I had this moment because I've had enough therapy that I was like, all this girl did was say hi to you, Nikki. This is not about her. This is about you. Why are you like in your head, right? I was like, hi, nice to meet you. I need to go get water now. I'm sure I acted a little strange, but then I was like, why am I acting like this towards this person? And I was like, she reflects all the parts that I don't like that I can't embody or I don't want to deal with in myself. Mm-hmm. Like that was like, it was one of those moments where I was like, yeah, she is she does all of the things that you just can't even envision. Like, I can't imagine living in a world where I just take time off and I go hang out on an island for a year. And that's what she had done. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, it made me uncomfortable and slightly resentful. Mm-hmm. And it had nothing I don't know this girl from Adam. She hasn't done anything to me, right? Like, I'm just having this conversation in my head, but I do think that when we're presented with that stuff, it's sort of worth noticing like, this might be something I should pay attention to in myself, because this is actually a reflection on me and my relationship to rest, my relationship to vacation, right? This isn't about this other person. And I think that's really important to point out. Of course, sometimes people can do toxic things to us, but in this case, this girl is perfectly lovely. She said hi, right? This is nothing to do with her.
Yeah. And I think, are we so attached to the struggle that like when we see other people, and I can so relate to this story, I feel like I kind of balance on this line between like, I do want to be the person who shows the real stuff and who is like, sometimes I have an offering and nobody signs up. Or, I've only made $100 this year in my business, or just kind of like those, like, it's a struggle and it's not, and that isn't necessarily, those things aren't necessarily bad because we can redefine what success means. And am I so afraid to just say that I'm like doing well and happy?
Yeah.
And right, like we're so addicted to the struggle. And if we aren't, then we're weak. Or we're lazy again, or, the people who are just like too happy, you're like, what the fuck? How are you so happy?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like kind of what we're unpacking here, right, is this like, I think as human beings, we're all inherently petty in really dumb ways. And I think that is very normal, but I think being aware of sort of when we're projecting something, right? I think that's a good time to become aware and turn in and be like, why am I projecting this? And I do think that sort of admitting some of these things to ourselves can be really hard, and admitting like, I'm much more comfortable being upset or anxious than I am actually being comfortable or happy. I don't associate those as being like safe feelings or safe spaces, like emotionally, if you will. Mm-hmm. And that's also really interesting to me, as has like something that I've sort of uncovered for myself in like the last, I would say 6 months, is like, I'm like, oh, I'm actually much happier and content in my life being less successful. And I'm air quoting for anyone who's not watching the video version of this, is like when I do less, when I try less hard, when I don't care as much, when I don't perform, I'm actually much happier operating at a lower level. Again, lower being in air quotes, because it's a lot more sustainable and it's actually health promoting. But that's not a very sexy message in the sea of you should always be more. And yet I think it's kind of the message that more people need to hear sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think that allows us to show up like way more authentically, which then allows us to connect with the right people. And I don't say right, air quotes, right, meaning that there's a right and a wrong in terms of how to behave. I'm saying like connect with the people who make me feel good, who, you know, we can have like good conversations with. But being authentic and showing up kind of just as we are allows us to do that. And we are social creatures and we need that. And when we're trying to operate at this high level, kind of as you mentioned, we're like connecting with all the wrong people. We're finding ourselves in all the wrong places for us. And I think that's part of body acceptance too. It's like, you know what? I am, you know, super goofy and really calm and really angry sometimes. And I'm like all of these things, and I'm allowed to show up as those things from time to time, whatever that means for me. I think that's all I had to say there. I thought I had one more thought and then.
No, I totally get it. And I think, you know, as we start to wrap, but I think the thought that comes to me too, which sort of brings full circle to something you said earlier, is this idea of when we're sort of more in touch with ourselves and authentically ourselves, it is easier to hold space for other people. And I think that part of that is that it's easier to separate ourselves from other people in a good way, right? Of being like, okay, I am here. This is me. These are my feelings. I can now, because I know where my feelings are, allow this other person to have their very human experience. And I do have to say that like, I'm way less judgmental is like this version of myself than the version of myself that was judging the girl who lived in Hawaii. This thought popped in my head. I met this person like once 6 years ago, but like now if I were to encounter that person, I would say their way of existing in the world still wouldn't necessarily mesh with generally my preferred way of existing in the world. But I wouldn't feel that visceral need to like walk away like I was a vampire and they were a clove of garlic. Like it'd be a very different, you know what I mean? Like it wouldn't hit me the same way. And I do think that when we talk about being more neutral and sort of being quote unquote tolerant, but not like tolerant in like the performing tolerance way that like we sometimes see, right? Again, on Instagram, and more of like actually being able to exist with people different than us. A lot of that is when you're comfortable with yourself, it's a lot easier to just kind of be in the world and not feel tortured.
That's a great sentence. When you're more comfortable with yourself, it's easier to be in the world and not feel tortured. It's as simple as that, folks. That's all.
There we go. We just solved all the problems now. I wish.
Yeah, but and being tortured, what a tough existence. And a lot of us have been there. And it's okay. It's maybe part of that processing, but it doesn't, you know, life gets to be pleasant and good. And again, I'm extremely privileged to the fact that I can even say that, you know, that I have all of my basic needs met and that I have time for rest. I mean, there are a lot of folks who don't have time to slow down or rest because they are in survival mode given our society. And at the same time, the world in which I want to exist in is the one where everyone is, fully in acceptance of themselves and aware of themselves, because I imagine a world in which we're also aware of ourselves, not to a point where we punish ourselves, but just this kind of more neutral acceptance, as you were saying, that we can move through the world, connect with others in meaningful ways, and just create a world that's kinder and easier to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of nearing these topics are big and complex and therefore can be, 4-hour conversations. But for the sake of it being an hour-ish long podcast, we're kind of hitting that kind of good stopping point. So is there anything that we didn't really cover in our conversation that you just think is important for people to know, or just kind of any final thoughts on these topics?
I think I just want to bring home that this concept is completely counter to our culture. And so it's going to be a difficult thing to navigate, because we live in a culture that doesn't want us. Not only have they not taught us to rest, but they don't ever want us to rest. And so it's just plain hard sometimes. And I will say, on the other side of that, and I by no means have reached this pinnacle at the top of the mountain and I've figured all of life out. Nope. But I will say, on the other side of that mountain is just kind of what you said, that navigating the world is just a bit easier and enjoyable. And if we can keep kind of the focus there instead of on navigating this process perfectly or quickly, or being the most woke, air quotes, person, or being the most, person that's into self-development, if we can focus on, I just want to navigate the world a little bit easier, I want to be kinder to myself and everyone around me, then that can help us kind of stay on that really aligned path.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're bringing up that really important piece of being kind of focused on the process versus being focused on an outcome or a goal. And I really do think that, and this is so much easier said than done. We all know this, particularly, but those of us who teach it many of us have had a hard time with this, but there really is sort of power in just being willing to be there in the process, whatever the process is for you in that moment, than trying to chase an outcome, because the outcome is usually really hollow. And also life is always changing. So it's not I think the only end game, not to be nihilistic, is death. So it's you're always going to be changing until you're dead. So right. I think that idea of just sort of being here I am, let me navigate this, whatever it looks like today, which some days are going to be good and some are going to be not great. And just kind of being okay with it all can be really powerful. So for people who want to connect with you, take class with you, learn about your work and the different things that you're doing, and who maybe want to be kind of more invested in this kind of experience of self-acceptance, exploration, yoga, where are the best places for people to connect with you or find you, either on the internet, or I don't know if you're doing real life things right now, because COVID has made our world very strange, very large, and very small all at the same time. Where should people find you?
Yes, both online and in person. So online, you can find me on Instagram at Caitlin Doherty Wellness, DOHERTY Doherty. And my website is CaitlinDohertyWellness.com. There you can find information about You can purchase on-demand workshops, so things that I've done in the past. And you can also book time with me to explore one-on-one mindful movement and one-on-one self-acceptance mentorships. And then my in-person opportunities are all outdoors right now. And I run a plus size and fat positive community called Fat Folks Adventure in Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't know if I already said Charlotte, but that's where I am because that's very important to know if you're wanting to attend in person. And we explore the outdoor areas of Charlotte through like mindful walks, yoga, meditation. And those are just a few ways to work with me and interact with me right now. And I would love to hear from you.
That's great. And you've got a newsletter too, right? So you send out some like free content for people who want to learn more about this?
Yes. Thank you. I do send out a newsletter every week. And then that includes a monthly private podcast episode too, which is kind of fun. And you can join that by going to my website, CaitlinDohertyWellness.com, or by clicking the link in my Instagram bio. It's called Dominant Culture Dropout. And I talk about all the things that we talked about today and much more.
Great. Well, I will link all of that up in the show notes. And thanks for being here and having this conversation with me, Caitlin.
Thank you, Nikki. Really enjoyed it.
And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already done so, please consider leaving the show a rating and review over on iTunes. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Catch you on the next one.